Hello, everyone. Welcome to Security Highlights. Today, we're going to talk about medical devices and cybersecurity, specifically focusing on the new guidelines that the FDA released about medical devices and cybersecurity. We have a special guest today, Mike Kijewski. Mike is the CEO and founder of MedCrypt. He's passionate about new advances in internet technology and healthcare and holds an MBA from Wharton School. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Okay, so let's start off with some questions. So, can you give us an overview of the new FDA guidelines for medical device cybersecurity that was recently released?
Yeah, essentially the headline is on March 29th, the FDA put out a notice that in the next 6 months, they plan to reject medical device regulatory submissions that fail to meet their cybersecurity guidance. In reality, they've been doing a little bit of that over the last couple of years anyway. But Congress, in their December omnibus funding bill, included a bunch of language that was previously part of something called the Patch Act, which motivated the FDA by increase in budget and some statutory authority to further their work to ensure that the medical devices and technology that they regulate are properly secure from cyber threats. So in reality, what the FDA has said is, over the last 10 years, we've been putting out increasingly specific and increasingly detailed guidance on what a secure medical device really looks like and what responsibilities a medical device manufacturer has around cybersecurity. And that those guidance documents have essentially become regulation overnight.
Okay, so what are some of following up on that, the major changes from the guidance since the last update? Is there significant compliance threats now from that medical device cybersecurity guidance?
Yes. So if you look at, if we take what's called the pre-market guidance for cybersecurity and medical devices, it's a series of documents that the FDA has put out since 2014, I believe, that set out the things that a device manufacturer needs to do around cybersecurity in order to get regulatory, to be in compliance with regulations. The 2014 version of the guidance was pretty short. I think it was like 7 or 8 pages. And it essentially said, you should think about cybersecurity and patient safety as you design your device. That's the summary of it. They put out a revised guidance in 2018, so 4 years later, that said, hey, you should think about cybersecurity in the design process, but in particular, you should make sure you're not doing things like, using old operating systems or reusing passwords or implementing poor cryptography. And then they came out with another revised draft in 2022 that was much, much more detailed. So that the 3 versions of the documents went from 7 pages to like 18 pages to 40-something pages. The 2022 guidance is really fairly detailed. And they did a very good job of including lots of examples and hypothetical situations in what device manufacturers should do. They spend a lot of time talking about what's called a software bill of materials. So essentially, medical device manufacturers need to know what software they're using, what vulnerabilities are in that software, or what known vulnerabilities are in that software. And then they need a process for updating their list of known vulnerabilities against the software they're using in the future. And that SBOM, software bill of materials, SBOM emphasis, it's probably the number one thing that the FDA is looking for in a device submission, because it's a relatively straightforward thing for a device manufacturer to do. If the device manufacturer hasn't done it, it's a red flag that maybe they haven't done some other things. So what the March refuse to accept guidance did is said, hey, all of that stuff we told you that you should be doing in the 2022 guidance document, now we're going to reject you if you're not doing it. So there wasn't really a whole lot of new specific security requirements or regulations in the omnibus bill and the refuse to accept guidance. It was basically the FDA saying, if you haven't been keeping up to speed and you're not doing what we told you to do in that 2022 guidance, then you're likely to receive a refuse to accept letter starting in October.
So a lot more teeth to it, a lot of thinking at first, and now it's actually, you better be doing.
Yeah, one of my frustrations. So you mentioned I'm currently CEO of a company called MedCrypt. We're a medical device cybersecurity company, and we work with the device manufacturers, not hospitals. And we tend to work a lot during the pre-regulatory submission phase. And for the last 4 or 5 years, we would talk to device manufacturers and say, "Hey, have you seen the FDA's cybersecurity guidance? We can help you do what the FDA is asking you to do." And some device manufacturers, not all, would say, "Yeah, we've seen it, but it's guidance. It's a recommendation. It's not a requirement. And therefore, we have a limited budget. We have limited time to get to market. We're only really going to do those things if the FDA forces us to do it. And we don't think they're going to force us to do it anytime in the near future." And that's a rational conclusion for them to have come to, given what the FDA had done previously. Now, essentially, the FDA is saying it's not optional. While the requirements come in the form of a guidance document for good reasons, they're essentially requirements and regulations. And if you don't meet them, we're planning to reject the devices. I think there are still some device manufacturers that question either the FDA's willingness to enforce those rules or their ability to enforce the rules. I talked to somebody yesterday who said, "Yeah, I think we might see, one RTA letter in late 2023 based on cybersecurity, and then the whole industry will scramble." But our company has seen 2 RTA letters in the last month from device manufacturers who are submitting to the FDA without, with apparently inadequate cybersecurity plans that the FDA is pushing back on. So I think this is a much bigger deal for device manufacturers than some of them know.
So what is that process? We talk about like submitting a letter. You're basically, do they have assessors that go out, or how is that process to actually work with FDA to get your device certified?
Yeah, good question. And to be clear, I'm not a regulatory expert. My background's in like the software that goes into medical devices like imaging systems, but our team has a couple of former FDA reviewers, and I've had the privilege of learning about the process from them. And essentially, I think some people think that the FDA tests medical devices to see if they should be approved, and that the FDA might be out there, penetration testing medical devices. And if there's a hacker at the FDA that finds a vulnerability, you're in trouble. That's not really the way it works, right? Essentially, the FDA says, here are the processes that a manufacturer of a medical device should be following. When you submit a device to us for consideration, you essentially need to convince us that you're following these rules and these regulations. So you need to tell us what you are doing to satisfy these rules. And if we are not adequately convinced by the data you've given us that you're following the right processes, we're going to ask for more information. And we're going to continually ask for more information until either it becomes clear that you're not doing these things, or you convince us that you are. So we had a customer a month ago, we're a relatively small medical device manufacturer, one product. It was a product that didn't directly connect to the internet, but it was based on a computer, and the computer has, network ports, and maybe it talks to other subsystems at a hospital. And they did a 5-thing. And in the cybersecurity section, they said, "Yeah, we've thought about security, and here's what we do. Like we turned on these features in Windows, and we use an antivirus program or whatever." And the FDA came back and said, "Hey, we're not going to accept this until you give us good answers to these questions." And there were 20 or 25 questions that were fairly detailed, right? Things like, have you really thought about what could happen to a patient if your device were to be tampered with by a hacker? And the customer had to go through and come up with, very detailed answers to the questions, explaining what controls were in place to prevent these bad things from happening. So it's a little bit like, to me, it feels a little bit like homework, right? Like if the FDA is giving you homework to say, "Hey, prove to me that you really know what's going on here." It's not the case that the FDA is going out there and, hacking the devices themselves.
Okay, so getting the data they need is really important to make sure that they see that you're thinking about this, you're doing your due diligence.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can imagine, for an agency that has listed cybersecurity as one of their top priorities, they're very sensitive to language that suggests you might be hand waving this away, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, and this is an example I see all the time, there's some language in the FDA guidance that says, these rules pertain to you if your device is connected. And there's a little bit of gray area about what is a connected device, right? So if you had, for example, a pacemaker that is connected directly to the internet via a cell chip, I don't think such a thing exists, but if you imagine it did, okay, that's clearly connected. But some device manufacturers would say, well, I make a pacemaker. The pacemaker is not connected to the internet, but it is connected to a phone, and the phone's connected to the internet, and we send data to the internet. But I don't really think it counts as connected. The FDA pushes back on that language. That might be an example that, a listener might say, wow, okay, clearly that thing's connected. But what about a device that's in a surgical suite? It's not directly connected to the internet, but it has a network port on it. And the network port isn't really designed to be used, but it could be used. Is that connected or not? And that's an area of disagreement between the FDA and device manufacturers. Device manufacturers will say, we didn't tell the customer to connect it, so no, it's not part of our labeling for the product. It's not connected. We've seen the FDA say, well, if a customer could reasonably see an Ethernet port and plug a network cable into it, and all of a sudden it's on the hospital network, you need to plan for that thing to be connected. So lots of gray area.
Yeah, what about like with healthcare organizations that have like an air gap network? That probably brings in some complications too. Maybe they're not directly connected to the network, but they still have somewhat of a local LAN or something. I'm sure that's more complicated as well.
Yeah, it's a good example. And my personal background is in radiation oncology, and generally those systems, they're super complex networks of multiple computers that work together to deliver care. And historically, those manufacturers have said, just put a firewall around this thing and don't connect it to anything else, and you should be fine. But usually what hospitals are doing is, they'll put a firewall around it, they'll put it on a subnetwork. But then, you really do need to connect this thing to the hospital's PACS system to get a CT scan to treat a patient. So we're going to connect to the PACS. And if the PACS is connected to the EMR and the EMR is connected to the internet. So is that a connected system, yes or no? Lots of device manufacturers would argue no. We've seen the FDA argue yes. So there's lots of gray area. And if you are a manufacturer of a device and you think that the comprehensive answer to the FDA's questions about cybersecurity is, well, we're really not connected, you need to be really convinced that that thing cannot be reasonably connected to the internet.
Wow, there's a lot of challenges there. So we got into a lot of the different FDA compliance and how to meet that. What would you say are the most significant cybersecurity risks facing medical devices and industry today and maybe in the future too?
Yeah, when I first started MedCrypt, so this is 2015, 2016, the example that always came up in conversation was this episode of a TV show called Homeland, where the vice president has a pacemaker and a terrorist was able to hack the pacemaker and kill the vice president. And this was like the canonical example of things that we should be concerned about in the healthcare space.
Yeah.
And you can imagine similar examples for, surgical robots or drug infusion pumps or insulin pumps. And those risks are real. That could potentially happen. But I don't think it's correct to say, that's the main risk that we have. And therefore, the probability of it happening is really low. And therefore, my effort to address it is really low. I think a more practical way to look at this is, I'm a medical device manufacturer and make a connected medical device. I need regulators around the world to be comfortable that this thing is safe and effective. I need customers, the buyers, hospitals or GPOs or individual patients to be comfortable that this thing is reasonably secure. And I need to have the ability to patch the software should there be vulnerabilities in the future, because vulnerabilities will come up. And therefore, the practical concern for a device manufacturer is less about, one of your patients dies because somebody hacks the device. That's possible, but unlikely. The more practical concern is, hey, somebody points out that you're using hard-coded usernames and passwords in this device, and it's trivially easy for somebody to log in and change the settings. And all of a sudden your customers are mad and the FDA is asking why you did that. And now you've got to pay, you have to incur expenses potentially of millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars to fix the issue in short order and get a software update out. That's really the practical risk for a device manufacturer. The patient risk is real. We shouldn't downplay it, but we also shouldn't rely on the fact that the probability is low to say, well, therefore this isn't a big concern.
So as a risk, then how do we as software companies, manufacturers mitigate that risk? How can we help
Yep.
device manufacturers or get over that risk?
Yeah, I think in the FDA guidance, they talk a lot about threat modeling. So essentially sitting down and saying, what are the bad things that could happen if somebody hacked this device? And once we identify what the bad things are that could happen, what controls should we put in place to stop those bad things from happening? And those are two very separate discussions, right? So I would recommend that if you're a device manufacturer, you're building a device, be really thorough in that asking that first question. What are all of the bad things that can happen? And don't say the probability is low or it would be hard or why would somebody do this? Try to come up with the superset of things that could potentially happen if somebody were to hack your device. Then it's okay to go through and say, which of these risks can be easily addressed with some control? And the control could be a software feature. It could be, a security product that you buy from somebody like what we make, or it could just be, labeling, telling the customer don't do X or don't do Y. But then once you've identified the things that can be easily fixed, again, what are the risks that we have that are really difficult to fix? And then you can think critically about, okay, do we need to address this risk directly, or is there a secondary control that we can put in place? Because the reason that I work in the healthcare space, and I imagine that you do as well, is ultimately we want to know that the work we're doing is helping patients. And the perfectly secure device is one that never makes it to market. We can't have that either, right? We need devices to get to market eventually. Patients need care. And therefore, we do need to be practical about what are the risks that we can easily control, and what are the things that just, listen, there's an inherent risk in this product. We've assessed it, and we're comfortable with it, and we think the FDA should be too.
And I think with a lot of cybersecurity, really the goal is enabling the business objective while being risk adverse and mitigating that risk. But sometimes there is a risk, and it's just how you mitigate that risk too. But yeah,
Yep.
a perfectly secure device might be in this bunker, but it's absolutely unuseful to anybody. So how do we make sure that we give some practical use to it, but make sure that there's a lot of risk mitigation in that too?
Yeah. I think a device manufacturer is much better off saying, we've identified this risk. Somebody could hack in and take over the firmware and make the device do something bad. Here are all of the controls that have been put in place to make it difficult to do. We still think there's a 1 in 10 billion chance that it could potentially happen. But putting in any additional controls would make the device less effective, or would decrease the battery life, and therefore it would hurt the patient outcome. And therefore, we've decided that this is an appropriate risk-reward ratio. And in my limited experience, the FDA has been very receptive to those things. What they're not receptive to is saying, we wrote custom firmware for this thing, and we're super smart, and it'd be very hard for somebody else to figure it out. Therefore, we don't need to worry about the security controls here. Or we need to be honest about what are the risks, and are we comfortable taking those risks? And we need to take some risks. That's a real trade-off we make.
Yeah. And Mike, what is the importance about putting that security at the start of that design? We talked about like some of these device manufacturers, they produce a device, but it's not secure, and then they have it out in the field, and then now how do they push it up to it, and it's built unsecure? How do you start building
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, as a cybersecurity person now, it's easy for me to say, oh, you should be thinking about this from day one. But in reality, day one for medical devices is sometimes, a biomedical engineer building a prototype in their lab or in their garage. And it's very unlikely that cybersecurity is part of that, very, very early prototype. But those very early prototypes have a sneaky way of ending up being pretty similar to the products that actually make it to market. And every phase gate that you push cybersecurity past means it will become more expensive to address it in the future. And I'll give you one really practical example. One of the things the FDA talks about in their guidance is having good cryptography to keep data private and to ensure that software updates are valid and that the data you're sending back and forth is valid. And the sort of common technology that's used to implement that is what's called public key cryptography. So a device needs to have a private key that nobody else knows. And the security of the system is essentially comes down to how securely can we store that private key? Well, there's really good hardware-based key storage systems that a device manufacturer can buy for, for pennies to put on their PCB to store private keys. But if you don't think about that early on, you might not order a PCB that has this hardware on it. And all of a sudden you're in a situation where you want to submit to the FDA in 6 months. You've decided you need cryptography. You've got a public key and nowhere to store it. And it may or may not be possible to securely store that key on a device without that hardware. So what do? Do you make a hardware change 6 months before the FDA submission? That's a huge, huge issue. So that's just, one example of many where pushing these decisions down the road can make addressing security exponentially more expensive in the future.
Definitely. Well, Mike, that was such a great discussion. I really appreciate it. Do you have any closing thoughts on cybersecurity, specifically medical devices, as we close this out?
Yeah. So in general, we're all in this space to help patients. And I think we need to be honest with ourselves about what risks we're willing to take on behalf of our patients around cybersecurity. It's more of a risk than many people wanted to think over the last few years. And ultimately, now with the FDA's new actions, if you want to get a device to market, you got to think about this early on. So don't be ashamed to say, hey, this isn't an area of expertise for our device manufacturer. Very few device manufacturers have had the budget historically to make this an area of expertise. You reach out and ask for help. We have a services group that can provide help during the design process. There are lots of other great service providers and security product companies out there that can help device manufacturers make their products safe and effective, both from a clinical perspective and from a cybersecurity perspective.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's a lot of experts out there. Take advantage of them. MedCrypt, DornerWorks, there's a lot of good companies that understand a lot of these challenges and have solutions as we keep going. And it's good. The goal has to be, how do we build a safer, more secure medical technology? And that's a really good place to end. Well, thanks so much for coming out today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Good for having me.